Hey everybody, Nick here, and today I got a review for you of this little guy right here. This is the Artisan Cutlery Sirius pocket knife. But first off, I want to thank Artisan Cutlery for sending these guys along. I got a chance to handle this guy at Blade Show West and was actually pretty impressed. There's a lot of good going on here, and they sent along both versions of it, the full tie and the G10 version. But as always, they know me. I told them I'm going to talk about the good, the great, the bad, the ugly. They've seen the disclaimer on my website that it might be a gem, it might be junk. They did still send it along. Nonetheless, we do have to assume these are the very best quality controlled ones of these guys ever, and I'm doing my absolute best not to let that affect the nature or the quality of my review. Next thing, let's do some size comparison, and I'll go ahead and I'll use the die version, and we'll start off with the Spyderco PM2, and what we're going to see is this is actually not small at all. If we measure the blade length on this guy, we are coming in just under 3.5 inches, right? This is a big old knife. And here it is next to PM2, where we're going to see, yeah, big old knife. In fact, the sharpened blade length is almost identical to PM2. Here it is next to the Spyderco Delica. We see here is, yeah, that's going to also be a relatively large knife. This comes in much larger than the Delica. Also worth thinking about thickness here. This guy is about the same thickness in the pocket as the Delica, which is actually something to keep in mind. Here it is against the Ontario Rat number 2, and what we're going to see here is, again, this is not a tiny knife, and then actually one other point of comparison here is the Monterey Bay Knives Everywhere Carry, EWC, in full titanium. This is another knife from exactly the same designer, from Ray Laconico, right? Although Artisan and MBK are very different companies, nonetheless, what we see here is that here we have very similar designs. In a lot of ways, the Sirius feels like a slightly blown-up version of this, but the blade length here is markedly smaller on the EWC. And so, but just to highlight that, you know, Ray Laconico's designs are roughly everywhere, and this is another one of them. And actually, that brings me to Ray Laconico is a designer who I've actually come to like and appreciate more and more as I've spent time in the knife world. His designs are all, in a lot of ways, very similar, and God knows he does them everywhere. He has collaborated with nearly every maker that I can think of at this point in time, but I really like them a lot because they tend to be very straightforward, function-forward, minimalist sort of knives. And so this is another one of the designs from Ray, and in fact, you can see here that they have got that on the back spacer here, our Laconico Artisan Cutlery, as opposed to on the spine of the blade, where it usually happens in the G10 version. So, nonetheless, that's kind of a cool little detail, and this is a Ray Laconico knife. Next thing, there are two versions of this knife. We have the this one down here is the G10 version, which you can probably tell from the fact that it's made of G10. And this is $70, and it has a thumb stud opener instead. It is a liner lock rather than a frame lock, etc. There is this version, and then there is this guy right here, which is a $200 knife in titanium as a frame lock. That is just a front flipper, right? There is not a separate thumb stud on this guy. This is a front flipper knife only. So there is that. There are a couple of other versions and colorways there. And actually, for the purposes of this review, I'm going to focus entirely on the titanium version. That is really the version that is worth doing and reviewing. And I'm not saying that, by the way, because I'm a snob and I like more expensive knives, but because they are very, very different knives, right? One's thumb stud, one's a liner lock, the other one's front flipper only, the other's a frame lock, right? They are very, very different knives, and the G10 one, unfortunately, has a number of flaws. So I'm going to focus on the Thai version here, and then I'll talk about the G10 version a little bit later on. So, anyways, there is, that's what I'm going to do here, and so let's go ahead and jump into the good, the great, the bad, and the ugly of this very interesting knife. So on the good side, start with, this is a very thin knife in the pocket, right? As I mentioned, this guy is actually not substantially thicker than your Spyderco Delica here in the pocket, and as a result, it carries quite nicely, right? It is a very nice carry as well because it is completely smooth along the back here with the blade nice and far away from the inside there. It is a front flipper, which means there's nothing hanging off the back side here, and there's really nothing to snag, right? Because the blade is almost entirely hidden within the body of the knife. This is a very, very smooth knife, and it is a very, very easy to carry knife, right? This works quite well. So I'm definitely a big fan of the fact that this is just very clean and svelte in the pocket. That's great. I'm also going to say that the titanium version here is very nicely machined. What you're going to see here is there is kind of a micro texture. There's this little area that's kind of milled out in the middle there, but on the rest of it, there is this sort of almost pinstriping effect here. And I know it's just tool paths, and I shouldn't be blown away by it, but at another level, you know what? Looks pretty good, right? It adds something to it. I mean, by the way, nice little bit of machining here on the, and the clip does not have that micro texturing by the way, but it's nicely done in that way. We also see that there is this nice little backspacer here, which not only contains a hidden lanyard hole, which is the best thing a lanyard hole can be, but it also has that little bit of engraving on there. It also has a very nice finish on the pivot here, as well as a lock bar insert, which serves as an over travel stop. You can see it just kind of posting in there, which prevents you from pushing the lock bar too far in this direction. And it's got nice little details here. For instance, that cutout to get to the lock bar there. It's very nicely done. I have to say, I appreciate the machining here. This has been done well. I also appreciate this little guy right here. This is the pocket clip, obviously, but there is no screw that is going into the pocket clip from this side. In fact, this screw here goes into the pocket clip, and the fact that the clip rests into a pocket of its own, effectively, very meta, right, but that is what is stabilizing the pocket clip on this dimension, so it doesn't wiggle around there. Also, the hidden lanyard hole is very nice, and that, again, makes this knife a very, very sterile-looking knife, right? You put it down on the table, and there's really not a lot going on here. It's mostly just shape. And I think that's kind of cool. The action on this guy is absolutely fine. It is a detent that is actually quite well-tuned for front flipping, right? It deploys very reliably without a whole lot of difficulty, and then on the close, it's very smooth as well. There's really not much to argue with the detent here. I think this is a knife that works quite well, and they've done a good job dialing the detent such that it's not too heavy for the front flipper, but it's also not like complete fall openy. This is pretty well tuned, I gotta say. Action-wise, they nailed it here. And then finally, on the good side, the blade here it's S35VN, which is actually a little bit surprising these days at this price point, but at the same time, it is a nice blade. S35VN is a good-to-go steel, and it is got a very nice swedge on it, which actually kind of helps to distinguish it a little bit, I think, from some of Ray's other designs, right? This is, in a lot of ways, like I said, similar to his general overall pattern, but that little bit of swedge on there, as well as the slight difference in angulation here, makes this it feels a little bit different. And the blade itself is good, with a nice flat area, a little bit of belly, a nice tip. This is absolutely just a fine little blade, and it works well for cutting things, although we'll talk a little bit about the edge a little bit later. So, to me, at least, all that is the good, is that it's got a nice blade, a fine action, a hidden clip screw. The thigh version is very nicely machined, and it is very thin and svelte in the pocket. On the great front, honestly, the design is what, wins the day here, right? Especially with a lot of the overseas collaborations, the design is the winner, right? That is the thing that makes the work interesting. It is a very clean design, right? It's fundamentally very sterile, very minimalist, right? And it's a little bit longer, actually, than Ray's usual, right? A lot of what Ray ends up doing, Ray Laconico, that is designer, is, right around that 3-inch mark. And this guy comes in right at that 3.5 point. I can't quite measure it as longer than that, which is good. No matter how much the cop dislikes you, this is going to come in under a 3.5-inch law. But still, it's a reasonably sized knife. It's actually borderline kind of big. And so that'll give you a different option here. But the thing is, there's really not that much going on here, but that's kind of the point, right? It's sort of a very minimalist, it's very sterile, and, it very much feels like a Laconico. I do feel like the design is carrying this knife, and I think if I didn't care for Ray's design aesthetic, I would 100% not be particularly enthused with it, but because I do, I think that smoothness, that cleanness, and that overall design is absolutely the great part of this knife, and I think that's what makes this interesting. So, to me, that's what's great. On the bad side, okay, start with price. It's okay. This guy is coming in at $200, and I gotta say, $200 for S35VN is getting less and less interesting these days. The bar is raising and raising and raising for $200 now, and a lot of people are doing 20CV made in the States for $200. Given, though, this is well machined. It's a titanium frame lock, which is still carrying some cachet for some folks. But the thing is, just a lot more people are doing great stuff for $200, so I think Artisan is really gonna have to start going every extra mile if they're gonna keep doing things like S35VN, which again is not a bad steel by any stretch of the imagination. It's a good-to-go daily carry steel, but they really need to make sure that they're nailing everything correctly if they want to continue inhabiting those sorts of price points, right? They need to be constantly upping their game because in many ways everybody else is. So ultimately, the price on this guy, it's okay, but I think with this design, which is quite excellent, it carries the day, right? So I feel like the price is okay here. Next thing, this guy has a very shallow carry. Well, maybe not very, but in practice, this guy, this much of this is going to be sticking up out of your pocket on a regular basis. That's great in some ways because it makes it very easy to grab the knife and pull it out. And in fact, the fact that you've got this screw right here gives you a little bit of extra gription, basically, as you're pulling this up out of your pocket. And so that can be a nice thing. But it is definitely a relatively shallow carry. And I'll also say that the clip is in the vicinity of the lock bar relief cutout there. And this being on the outside rather than the inside does allow your the material of your pants to kind of snag on there from time to time. It's not the end of the world, but it might have actually been nice to see that relief on the inside of the knife. Next thing, and actually one other thing I should probably highlight is that this is not flat. This is, by the way, radiused. This entire thing here is a continuous kind of curve to it rather than just being a flat piece. So that is a nice thing, and that's not bad. It's just something I forgot to mention earlier. Next thing, this guy is a front flipper knife, and it is a front flipper only. There is really not a great way. I mean, you can get in there and pinch it open with some very detailed thumb grabbing, but ultimately this is a front flipper only knife. And for me, it's not really, I can't really get around it with the top there. This is a sort of lighter style open, where you take your hand, you hold it in your hand, usually using the clip here, and then you push with your thumb against this tab, and the knife comes flying open, right? Front flippers are great in a lot of ways, but they're really not for everybody, right? There is a lot of fine motor control required to use this knife, because you need to be able to grab the knife in a way that is, well, suitably secure, while not putting too much pressure on the lock bar here, which is one of the downsides of a frame lock, right? The lock bar pressure is able to, if you have the lock bar held too tightly, then you end up increasing the detent pressure, and then you kind of got to go the other direction with your thumb and pop this whole thing out, and especially given that, you know, hands vary, this might not be for everybody, right? And by the way, I think front flippers are one of those things that I've kind of, in my time as a reviewer, they're great, but at another level, they're just a lot of people who they're not going to work for. So do keep that in mind, right? And especially given this guy's being relatively thin, being relatively light, and being relatively long, for me, the front flipping only thing felt a little bit more like a form over function thing. It is absolutely beautiful. It's very clean, but it's not something that you're going to want if you are needing to deploy your knife instantly all the time, right? In a lot of ways, the thumb stud approach is nicer for just quick deployment, reliable deployment, with a whole lot less in the way of fidgeting and fine motor stuff than the front flipper only version is. But, you know, like I said, so there is that. Next thing, the balance on this guy is a little further back than I'd like it to be. It balances right about here. And given that you're going to be reliably gripping up here, it just ends up feeling a little tiny bit back heavy. Is it the end of the world? No, absolutely not. But it is a little bit on the back heavy side, and I think that's something that maybe they could have, if they'd gone in there and done a little bit of internal milling or something like that, I think they could have lightened that up a little bit and really earned that little bit of extra mile, right? It's not bad, but I think that's something they could have done to improve it. And then finally, the thing I'm probably least enthusiastic about is that this guy is not terribly thin behind the edge. This has an edge grind that comes back to like 2018, right? This is thicker. Here, I'll show you what I'm saying here. This is thicker than it needs to be, and in fact, it is much thicker than, well, not much thicker, but it is actually thicker than on the AR RPM 9 steel that they did for the other version here. And if we compare it against the Monterey Bay Knives version, what we see here is this is just massively thinner, right? This is a little detail, but in practice, it does add up. It does add to the cutting power of the knife in a lot of ways. And so I kind of feel like, especially given that it is thicker behind the edge than even the budget version of it, it's like, guys, finish grinding the knife. That's not super impressive. And that's something I want to see all the makers getting right all the time. And, you know, given this is certainly a lower grind than most, but still, they could have done that a little bit better, right? So to me, all of that is the bad, is that it could have been thinner behind the edge. The balance is a little further back. Front flippers are definitely not a fine motor friendly sort of, well, they require fine motor, so I guess they're friendly to it. Look, they're not for everybody, right? It's a very shallow carry, and the price is sort of okay, but only because the design is good. There's nothing particularly ugly here, so let's go into the final conclusion. But actually, before I do that, I want to give a quick conclusion on this little guy right here. This is the G10 version of it. And, you know, honestly, I don't think that the G10 version needed to be a thing, or frankly should have been a thing, right? Artisan, I like Artisan a lot in a lot of ways. They have some very, very nice knives out there in the world these days. One, like the Artisan and CJRB, they've got like the Rhea is a very nice piece, or the Arroyo are very, very nice pieces and very much more budget-friendly sorts of knives. But the thing is, Artisan is a company that feels very devoid of editing, right? If something knife-shaped makes it to the factory, they make it and they ship it and they are enthusiastic about it. And I really feel like it's a company that would be massively improved by periodically saying, you know what, this one didn't turn out so great. Let's just skip this model and scratch it. And I kind of feel like the G10 version could have been a model that they skipped, right? Because although I do like the thumb stud opening a little bit better than I like the front flipper, that has major consequences, right? Ergonomically, suddenly you have this weird cutout in the middle of the freaking scale, which... really? I don't like it. It kind of breaks up very substantially the cleanness of the design. It makes it feel something very different. And it is just less well made. I mean, watch this assembly video, and I feel like it's not just the fact that it's cheaper that's going on there. This wasn't done great, and the ergonomics, unfortunately, go to heck having this little bit here. And also, it's just the thumb stud is like super tall and super long. The lock bar access is kind of brutal because it doesn't actually dip down here, except in this, you're kind of having to like jam the very tip of your thumb in there and kind of push it over to the side, which exposes your knuckle here. And then overall, just there are sharp edges all around this. This whole thing needs a visit from the chamfer fairy, or just toss the blade in a tumbler a little bit. Whatever it is, this just ended up being a knife that was very unimpressive to me, right? I mean, don't get me wrong. It's not terrible, right? It's a better knife than some of the things that, well, frankly, that even Artisan has dropped. But at the same time, and somebody could very much enjoy it. Somebody could carry it and be happy with it, especially if they don't handle a bunch of other knives. But to me, at least, it's just... it's not big, it's not great work, right? I know that Artisan can do budget knives very well, but I feel like they just didn't here, right? And particularly next to the Thai one, it's just like, guys, you should have stopped while you were ahead, right? This right here is a very nice knife, and this right here is like, really? Did you need to do that? No. And so, it's not bad, but imagine you go to a freaking art show or something like that, and you see, like, beautiful painting, beautiful painting, beautiful painting, beautiful painting, all from this artist. You're like, wow, this person's amazing. Then the last one, their pièce de résistance, is just terrible crap. Looks like a freaking kindergartner did it. How are you going to leave that show feeling? Probably not as good. And I kind of feel like, unfortunately, this guy next to this guy really didn't end the show particularly well for him, right? It's not bad, but it's just not that good either. And it reflects poorly on the rest of the line that they don't seem to have seen the difference and ship both of these with as much enthusiasm. So it's not awful, but I just can't recommend the G10 one either. There were just much better options for $60. And so ultimately, although I carried it, I tried it, I just didn't end up caring for it. But the thing is, there are good options out there, and I would say the titanium one is a good one. It's much more expensive, right? That's for sure. But this is, frankly, the way I think that this knife... okay, I'm not the designer, but this is the way I think this one should have gone, right? This is kind of in harmony with what's going on. And I think there's a lot of good here, right? Because it's nicely thin in the pocket. It's nicely machined. Got a hidden clip screw, hidden lanyard hole, which is the best thing either of those things can be, I guess. It's got a very fine action, well-tuned for front flipping, a nice blade, and a very nice design. And honestly, the design is sort of what makes this remarkable. The price is kind of okay. The carry is shallow. Front flippers aren't going to be for everybody. The balance a little further back, and it could be thinner behind the edge. But honestly, I can see the Thai version appealing to some folks. You do, though, 100% have to love the design, right? If you're looking at this and you're going, that's nothing special, or that's just, it's knife-shaped, why do you care? Then you don't want this knife, like flat out. The knife does nothing at all unique or interesting that isn't this design. And if you're not a fan of clean, sterile, minimal, or just Ray's work in general, this is not going to do it for you at all. You're done here. There's no reason to consider this at all. And of course, there are lots of ways to get Ray's work now. Ray has designs with pretty much every maker I can think of. And although they're all a little bit different, they're all not that different. And in many cases, you can get things like, well, thinner grinds and things like that off of some of the other collaborations out there in the world. So this is sort of a piece where you have to be a real big fan of the Laconico design, and you have to like this particular one a great deal. If this particular one, whether because of its size, it being 3.5 versus a lot of his other stuff, or whether just the individuality of this particular thing, or maybe you're just a completist, you don't want to pick up all race stuff, then this could be interesting. And ultimately, I guess that's kind of how I feel about it. Is if this particular design appeals to you, and you're looking for something that is pretty long, that's sterile and very minimal, and very much want to raise designs, but maybe a little bit different, then you might seriously consider this guy. Get it? Serious? But otherwise, yeah, I don't think you need to be a serious buyer. So anyways, there you go. Hope this has been interesting to you, and have yourselves an absolutely wonderful rest of your day. Oh, man, I should have called this a dog star. Okay, bye now.